had not seen the town of Gray Harbor in almost 20 years. My earliest memories were carved into its crooked cobblestone streets and the sound of the tide gnawing at the seawall like teeth on bone. I left when I was 19 and swore never to return. Promises are easier to make when you believe distance will last forever. The bus from Boston dropped me at the corner where the main road bent toward the water. Gray Harbor's air was a living thing. It pressed in heavy and damp, smelling of brine and rotting seaweed. The fog had no edges. It swelled and sank, rolling between the narrow houses whose shingles had turned the same dull gray as the ocean. I came back because of the letter. No name on the return address, only a place: Wharf Road, Gray Harbor, Massachusetts, and inside a single sheet of paper in handwriting, I knew before I finished the first line. You left something here. Come before the tides change. It was signed with nothing. But the slant of the letters was my father's. He had been dead for 14 years. The streets were mostly empty. I passed the fish market and saw the same sign that hung there when I was a boy, the paint blistered but still showing a red lobster with one claw missing. The only open shop was a narrow cafe with 2 dim lamps burning in the windows. An old man sat inside with his back to me. I stood there for a moment, my breath misting, waiting for him to turn his head. He never did. The boarding house was at the far end of Wharf Road. It had once been pale blue, my mother told me, but now the wood was silvered and peeling. The door was unlocked. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of kerosene and damp rope. Mrs. Hanley ran the place. She had looked ancient when I was a boy, and she looked no younger now. She handed me a brass key without speaking and motioned me toward the stairs. Her eyes were the same pale gray as the fog outside, and they lingered on me for a second longer than was comfortable. Room 3 overlooked the harbor. Through the warped glass I could see the masts of fishing boats swaying in the mist. A gull sat on the railing outside, motionless, staring in. I tapped the pane with my knuckle and it did not move. When I drew the curtain, its shadow still clung faintly to the glass. The first night should have been nothing more than exhaustion. The bus ride had left me sore and dizzy. I ate a sandwich from the cafe downstairs and tried to read. Around 10, the fog outside thickened until the lamplight on the dock was only a pale smudge. The air tasted of metal. Somewhere close, a bell began to ring. I thought it was the buoy offshore, but it was not the same slow, hollow chime I remembered. This one was sharper, irregular dot. It stopped. Then the sound of footsteps came from the hallway outside my door. They were too slow, dragging, as if the person were unsure where to go. I waited for a knock. None came. The steps passed my door and continued toward the far end of the hall. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The dim bulb above flickered once. The carpet was damp under my bare feet. A faint smell of salt water lingered, stronger here than in my room. I followed it toward the far end of the hall, where a narrow window looked out on the street. Something wet streaked the glass. Not rain. It was thicker, almost oily, glistening in the lamplight outside. Then I noticed the marks on the floorboards, narrow, parallel lines running from the window toward the stairs. They were as thin as fingernail scratches and glistened as if fresh. When I returned to my room, the curtains I had closed earlier were open. The gull was gone, but the glass was wet, and there was something resting on the sill. It was a key. Not like the brass one Mrs. Hanley gave me. This one was blackened iron, heavy, the kind you saw in pictures of old prison locks. It was cold enough to burn my palm. On its bow, scratched deep into the metal, was a number. 6. I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt as if someone were standing just at the edge of the room, behind the curtains, waiting. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of water dripping inside my wardrobe. When I opened it, the smell of the harbor poured out so strong it made my eyes sting. The floor inside was dry. Just before dawn, I heard that bell again. This time, I knew it was not offshore. It was somewhere inside the boarding house. When I went downstairs for breakfast, Mrs. Hanley was nowhere to be found. The dining room was empty, except for a man in a dark coat sitting at the far table. He was eating slowly, methodically, without looking up. I took a seat by the window. The fog outside was so dense that the dock seemed to float in a white void. After a few minutes, the man rose, set his spoon down, and walked toward the door. He passed behind me without a sound. Only when the bell over the door jingled did I glance up. The chair he had been sitting in was wet. The plate and spoon were gone. In their place was a folded scrap of paper. Inside, in that same familiar handwriting, were 4 words: "The tide is wrong." I decided before breakfast was finished that I would leave Gray Harbor that afternoon. Whatever had brought me back here, whatever force had scrawled my father's hand across those notes, it was not worth chasing. The fog was heavier than it had been the night before. I could barely see the buses idling along the main road. Each one hissed steam into the air like a living thing breathing. Mrs. Hanley was behind the counter. When I returned to my room to pack, she did not look up when I passed. Her voice was so low I almost missed it. "You cannot leave on the wrong tide." I stopped, my hand on the railing. "What does that mean?" She still did not look at me. "The key you found is not yours. Put it back before the tide turns, or you will never put it down." When I tried to speak again, she raised her hand, and I went cold all over. There was something under her fingernails, not dirt, not polish, but black grit, like the residue from burnt wood. At the bus depot, the attendant told me no buses were running. He gave no explanation. The ticket window glass between us was streaked with salt, as if seawater had dried there hours earlier. With nowhere to go, I walked down Wharf Road toward the docks. The masts of the boats rose out of the fog like skeletal fingers. The water was the color of slate. A boy stood at the far end of the pier, barefoot, his trousers rolled to the knee. He stared into the water without moving. I called out to ask if his parents were nearby. He did not answer. When I reached him, I saw that his skin was so pale it was almost blue. His hair clung wetly to his forehead. "Do you know what the tide is doing today?" I asked. He turned to me. His eyes were cloudy, as if filmed over, but I could still feel them fix on mine. "It is not our tide anymore." Before I could respond, he stepped forward and dropped silently into the water. I lunged to the edge, expecting to see him thrashing. The surface was calm. I returned to the boarding house, shaken. Room 3 felt smaller than before. The curtains swayed faintly, though the windows were shut tight. The iron key lay on the table where I had left it. I decided to leave it outside Mrs. Hanley's door. The hallway was dim and smelled faintly of fish. Halfway down, I heard something on the stairs below, a slow, uneven scraping, as though someone were dragging their feet upward. The sound stopped. I leaned over the railing. The staircase vanished into shadow after the first few steps. A hand came into view on the banister. The skin was white and bloated, the nails dark. Another hand followed. Then a face, pale hair slicked flat, eyes fixed straight ahead. It was the boy from the pier. Water streamed from his clothes in thin black rivulets that left stains on the carpet. He did not look at me as he climbed. His lips moved slightly, as if reciting something too low for me to hear. I stepped back toward my room, but the key in my pocket burned suddenly against my leg. The boy reached the landing, turned his head toward me, and opened his mouth. Seawater poured out, hitting the floor with the sound of stones dropping into a deep well. I locked my door and shoved the iron key under the wardrobe. The smell of salt grew stronger until it was almost choking. A thud came from beneath the floor. Then another. The boards shivered under my feet, as though something heavy was moving directly beneath the building. My eyes went to the wardrobe. The key was no longer there. It was on my bed. The key sat in the center of my bed, as if it had been placed there with care. Droplets of water clung to its black surface. I had left it under the wardrobe less than a minute earlier. I did not touch it. Instead, I went downstairs to find Mrs. Hanley. The fog outside pressed against the windows. so thick it felt like the glass was holding back an ocean. She was in the kitchen, standing over a pot that steamed faintly. The air smelled faintly of brackish water. Without looking up, she said, "You did not put it back where it belongs." I told her it had moved on its own. She shook her head. "No, it followed you because you are the last name on the ledger." "What ledger?" I asked. She wiped her hands and led me down a narrow hallway behind the kitchen. The boards creaked as we descended a steep set of stairs. At the bottom was a locked door of heavy wood, stained black at the base, as if it had been submerged in dark water. She took the key from my hand, without asking. The lock turned with a groan. Inside was a single oil lamp on a table and a large book bound in cracked leather. She opened it to a page near the back. The ink was faded, but I could still read the neat columns of names and dates. My father's name was there, beneath it, in a space that looked like it had been left blank for years, was mine. Mrs. Hanley's finger tapped the margin. "The tide will take what it is owed. Your father tried to leave. The tide brought him back." Before I could demand what that meant, something heavy struck the far wall. The lamp guttered. A wet scraping began, like barnacles tearing free from wood. Mrs. Hanley blew out the lamp and hissed that I should go. I stumbled up the stairs in the dark. Behind me the scraping quickened, turning into a sharp rattle like dozens of shells grinding together. At the top, I slammed the door and turned the bolt. The wood shuddered once, twice, then went still. Back in my room, the fog pressed so tightly against the window that it looked like stone. I was shaking too hard to think. That was when the bell began again. This time it came from the hallway outside my door. I opened it a crack. The boy from the pier was standing there. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, water streaming from his mouth. The carpet around his bare feet was dark with wetness. In his hands he held a length of frayed rope. He stepped forward, and I slammed the door. The key in my pocket dug hard into my thigh, almost like a hook catching flesh. The door rattled once. Then the window behind me burst inward with a sound like splitting bone. A rush of cold, salt water poured into the room, knocking me off my feet. The boy was gone from the hall. He was in the room now, moving through the rising water as if it were air dot. His cloudy eyes fixed on me. His lips moved. I caught fragments of words beneath the hiss of the tide. "Not our tide. Not yours either." He lunged. I grabbed the wardrobe and hauled myself up as the water reached my chest. The boy's hand clamped on my ankle, cold, hard, with a strength far beyond anything human. Something slammed against the building from outside. The water receded in an instant, leaving the floor soaked but empty. The boy was gone. On the bed, where the water line had soaked the blanket, was a folded scrap of paper, the same handwriting as before. "Bring the key to room 6 before nightfall, or the tide will come inside." By the time I went downstairs, the fog had turned the windows into mirrors. The bell had not rung again, but the words on the paper felt heavier than the key in my pocket. Mrs. Hanley was gone. The kitchen smelled faintly of seawater again. The hallway that led to room 6 was darker than the others. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. My steps sounded muffled, like I was walking on wet cloth. The key slid into the lock without resistance. I turned it, and the door swung inward. The room was empty, except it was not. The furniture was covered with white sheets, but they bulged in strange shapes, as though they draped over things not entirely human. The air was damp and still. Against the far wall stood a single trunk, the wood swollen and blackened like it had been pulled from the ocean floor. On its lid was carved a date, October 18th, 1892. When I touched the lid, the sheets shifted. I froze. One by one, they slid to the floor, revealing chairs, a bed frame, and a wardrobe, all marked with deep grooves, as if something had clawed them. The trunk's lock broke with a snap. Inside were bundles of rope, rusted shackles, and a thick ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The pages smelled of salt and rot. The entries were lists, not of names, but of vessels, tides, and storms. At the bottom of each was a note in smaller handwriting. Payment taken. Payment still owed. The last entry, from 30 years ago, read simply, ledger closed. The Hanley line paid in full. The Walker line to pay next. My hands shook. Walker was my mother's maiden name. The floorboards beneath the trunk groaned. A dark stain spread outward, the wood softening under my boots. From below came the faint sound of water slapping against stone. I stepped back. The boards caved inward, and a black arm shot through the gap. Fingers long and jointed like a crab's legs, clutching at the air. I bolted for the door. It slammed shut in my face, the lock clicking on its own. The arm groped along the floor until it found the trunk. With impossible strength, it dragged it into the hole. The ledger went with it. The sound of it vanishing into the water below was like something sliding into a throat. The silence after was worse than the noise. Then the sheets began to rise again. This time there was nothing beneath them. They rose on their own, drifting toward me like pale figures in the dark. The cold intensified. I pressed myself against the door, but it would not open. A voice spoke behind me. Low, wet, and close. To my ear, the tide remembers. Something yanked me backward. My shoulders struck the wall, and for a moment the room was gone. I was underwater, the current pulling me toward a lightless trench. Shadows moved all around, their hands reaching. My lungs burned. I broke the surface on the hallway floor, choking up salt water. The door to room 6 was wide open. The sheets were gone. So was the trunk. On the threshold was another scrap of paper. The same handwriting. It will take you before the next full tide, unless you give it another name. The morning light in Gray Harbor was the color of old teeth. The fog had thinned, but the streets were empty. The only sound was the gulls circling somewhere above the harbor, their cries sharp and distant. I needed answers. I could not keep pretending that room 6 was just some trick of my nerves. The main street was a crooked stretch of cobblestone lined with clapboard shops, most with their shutters drawn. A small grocery store stood open, its windows fogged from inside. I stepped in, and the bell over the door rang softly. The man behind the counter was wiry and sunburned, his hands dark with old scars. He looked up and froze when he saw me. Walker, he said. His voice was flat. You should not be here. I told him I was just visiting. His eyes narrowed. Visiting folk never stay long. I tried to ask about the Hanley Inn, about the date carved into the trunk in room 6. His gaze shifted past me, toward the door. You ask too much for someone who has not yet given. He would say nothing more. When I left, he locked the door behind me. On the pier, the smell of salt and fish was stronger. An older fisherman sat mending a net, his back bent like a hook. His eyes were pale and clouded, but they fixed on me with startling focus. The tide knows you now, he said, without introduction. You got its mark. You will hear it at night, and you will think it is the wind. I asked what it wanted. Names, he said, or bodies. He leaned closer. The Hanleys learned to give names before the tide came for their own. I asked him what happened if you did not give it a name. His hands stopped moving. Then he pushed the net into my arms. It smelled of brine and something older, something metallic. If you cannot bring yourself to give, you can always go down there yourself, he said. But you will not like what you see. The fog rolled in again before noon. By the time I returned to the inn, the street lamps were lit, their glow swallowed by the mist. In my room, the window was open. On the sill sat a jar filled with seawater, the surface rippling as if something moved beneath it. I stepped closer. A single black finger broke the surface, jointed and chitinous, curling toward me. I knocked the jar over. The water spilled across the floor and vanished into the cracks between the boards. That night I dreamed I was standing knee-deep in the harbor. The water was cold, but the tide pulled warm against my legs. Figures stood around me in the fog, whispering my name. When I woke, my feet were wet. The church stood at the top of the hill like a sentinel, its white paint flaking to gray under the salt air. The bell tower leaned slightly, as if straining toward the sea. I climbed the hill in the pale morning light, carrying the fisherman's words with me. Names or bodies inside. The air was cool and still. Rows of pews stretched toward a modest altar, where a cross hung above a tarnished silver chalice. The scent of candle wax and mildew mixed into something faintly metallic. An elderly man sat at the organ, his long fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. He did not look up as I entered. "The records," I said. "I am doing family research." Without a word, he rose and walked to a small side room. I followed, my footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. The room was lined with shelves, stacked with leather-bound ledgers. He pointed to a lower shelf and left me alone. I opened the first book. The ink had bled with age, but the entries were careful. Names, dates, causes of death. Some were ordinary pneumonia, accident, old age. But every few pages, the same phrase appeared in the margin, written in a hand too steady to be casual, given to the tide. The dates stretched back more than a century in the most recent ledger. My stomach turned when I reached the last page. The last entry was from the week before my arrival. It listed a name I did not recognize, followed by the phrase. Beneath it, written in the same neat hand, was another name, Walker Hayes. The ink was still fresh. I heard the scrape of wood outside the room. When I stepped into the main chapel, several townsfolk were sitting in the pews, all facing forward, their eyes fixed on me. The elderly man was back at the organ, and this time he pressed a single low note that trembled through the floor. A woman in the front row rose. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "The tide has been asking for you for a long time." I backed toward the doors. Two men in heavy coats stood blocking the exit. The organ note deepened, vibrating in my bones. Somewhere beneath it, faint but growing, I heard the rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. The townsfolk began to hum in unison, their mouths closed, the sound coming from somewhere deeper than their throats. I ran for the side door, burst into the fog, and nearly slipped on the wet stones of the hill road. From the harbor below, a shape rose in the mist, too tall to be a mast, too thin to be a cliff. It swayed, then stilled, as if watching me. The fog was thicker than I had ever seen it. I could not tell if it was morning or evening. The street lamps glowed faintly, halos suspended in the gray. Somewhere below, the harbor bell clanged once. I kept moving, trying to put distance between me and the church. My boots scraped against cobblestones slick with moisture. Behind me, footsteps began to follow. At first I thought it was one person, then another pair joined, then more. I turned into a narrow alley between two salt-bleached houses. The smell of fish guts and engine oil hung heavy in the air. When I reached the other end, a figure stood waiting. His coat was soaked through, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Walker Hayes," he said, as if testing the name in his mouth. His voice carried the same low vibration I had felt in the church floor, from the fog behind me. More shapes emerged, men and women, some holding ropes, others with empty nets dragging at their sides. The air thickened, the damp settling into my lungs. Then I heard it, not through my ears, but somewhere deeper, threaded into my ribs. "Come to me." The voice was neither male nor female. It rolled like a wave, heavy and slow, but it carried a pull that made my legs ache to move toward it. I pressed my back to the wall, my hands against the wet shingles. I told myself to run in the opposite direction, but the voice came again, stronger, curling inside my skull. "You are already mine." I pushed past the man in the coat. He did not resist, only turned to follow. The others joined, their footsteps matching mine in a steady, measured rhythm. The main street opened ahead, but instead of shops, I saw only more fog, curling low over the ground. The bell clanged again, closer this time, though I could not see the harbor. The voice rose in my chest. Names or bodies. You bring one, or you give yours. I stumbled onto the pier. The planks creaked under my weight. Water slapped against the pilings below. Out of the mist, a shape surfaced, a slick, black form taller than a man, faceless but crowned with spines that dripped brine. Its presence made the air colder, the fog denser. The townsfolk fanned out behind me, blocking the way back. Some lowered their heads. Others watched without blinking. The thing in the water leaned closer, and I realized the movement was not its own. The tide itself was pulling it toward me. Come now. The pier shuddered. A wave broke against it, sending spray into my face. The cold shocked my breath short. I turned, but the way was gone. The townsfolk had stepped forward in unison, closing the circle. The voice came one last time, filling the marrow of my bones. Choose no. One moved at first. The fog swelled between us, rippling as though stirred by something beneath. The figure in the water did not blink. It had no eyes, but I felt its attention tighten on me like a rope. A man stepped forward from the line of townsfolk. His face was thin, the skin pulled tight over high cheekbones. His voice was flat. It is already decided. The others echoed the words, their voices overlapping in a low, seamless chord. I said I had done nothing, that I had just arrived, that I owed nothing to their tide. The man shook his head. The debt was written before you were born. Something brushed my ankle. I looked down, expecting a stray rope. Instead, a slick black tendril was sliding across the pier, leaving a dark sheen behind. It retreated when I stepped back, but I could still feel the cold it had left on my skin. I ran. The crowd did not chase. They only turned and began walking after me at the same measured pace. The streets were wrong. Corners that should have led uphill now sloped downward. Buildings I recognized from my arrival stood in places they had not been before. The cobblestones were wet with more than mist. They glistened as though freshly pulled from the ocean floor. The bell clanged again, impossibly close. I reached the edge of the docks and nearly fell over a low gunwale. A fishing vessel sat rocking gently, its nets piled high. No crew, no movement. Behind me, the townsfolk closed in. One of them, a woman with hair plastered to her face, pointed to the boat. Her lips did not move, but I heard her all the same. Bored. I backed away. The pier planks groaned under my weight, then gave a subtle shudder, as if the structure itself was nudging me toward the vessel. I climbed in, thinking I could use it to escape by sea. The moment my boots hit the deck, a rope snaked from the dock to the bow and pulled tight. The townsfolk stopped, watching. The boat began to drift. No one was at the wheel. The water below was dark, unnaturally so, swallowing what little light there was. As the fog closed in, I heard the voice again, not from the water this time, but from inside the hull, as though the wood itself had been soaked in it for years. We go where the tide waits. The shore vanished. Only the black water remained. Somewhere ahead, something moved, a slow, deliberate rise that broke the surface without sound. The fog swallowed the world until there was only the boat, the water, and the sound of my own breathing. The deck swayed gently, but every movement felt wrong, as though the sea below was not following the wind. The black shape ahead sank back beneath the surface without a ripple. A silence followed, deep enough to make my ears ache. I gripped the wheel, but it spun loosely. The rudder did not answer. The boat moved on its own, steady as a pulse, carrying me into thicker darkness. Something thumped below deck. I froze. Another thump, slower this time, like the drag of a heavy weight across wet wood. I told myself it was cargo shifting, but the sound came again, closer to the steps leading up to the deck. Then a wet hand appeared on the railing. The figure that climbed up was hunched and shivering. Water dripped from his hair, his clothes clinging to him like seaweed. His face was pale, lips blue. But I recognized him, the fisherman who had stood beside the man in the coat on the pier. He stared at me without blinking. Then his mouth opened, and water spilled out, streaming down his chin. When he spoke, his voice was not his own. It was the tide's, curling up through his throat. It is not far now. The deck tilted, though no wave had touched us. The fisherman moved with it, his steps matching the unnatural sway. As he came closer, I saw the ridges beneath his skin, the faint shifting of something moving inside his chest. I backed toward the stern. My boot struck the coiled rope, and I grabbed it, ready to swing if he lunged. But he stopped, tilting his head, as if listening to something beneath the boat. A hollow knock came from below the keel, once, twice, then a long scraping sound that traveled from bow to stern. The fisherman smiled. His teeth were black with rot. "It knows you." The water around the boat began to churn. Shapes moved beneath the surface, just out of sight, their outlines breaking and reforming in the gloom. The tide's voice rose, not in my head now, but in the air itself, carried by the mist. "You are the end of the line." The fisherman's body shuddered violently, and his jaw unhinged, wider than any human should. Salt water poured out, pooling at his feet, carrying with it something small and glistening, a tooth, a nail, a fragment of bone. The sea beneath us bulged, lifting the boat as if we had come aground on something vast and living. The fisherman reached for me. The fisherman's fingers were cold and slick, like holding the belly of a dead fish. He pulled me toward him, his eyes gone pale, the pupils drowned in milky white. The boat tilted harder, groaning as something massive rose beneath us. I wrenched free, slamming the coil of rope across his face. He staggered, but did not fall. His mouth stayed open, the voice of the tide pouring out. "Step forward, and the water will know you." The hull shuddered again. Then the sea broke. It was not a creature in any shape I could name. It was the water itself, folding upward, taking the suggestion of limbs and a head, though they dissolved and reformed with each swell. Its surface was skin one moment, slick kelp, the next den only darkness. The smell of brine thickened until breathing felt like swallowing salt. Every sound was drowned out by the pull of the water around us, as if the ocean was breathing in and waiting to close its mouth. The fisherman dropped to his knees, bowing low. His chest split along hidden seams, spilling a surge of seawater that rushed across the deck. From within, pale shapes wriggled free and slid toward me, eyeless, faceless, but moving with purpose. I backed to the stern. The fog thinned just enough for me to see how far we were from land. There was no land, only black water in every direction. The tide's form leaned closer, its surface rippling in slow undulations. When it spoke, my knees buckled. "You were marked before your first breath. We have come for what was promised." The water at my feet rose to my shins, then my knees. The pale shapes climbed my legs, heavy as anchors. I grabbed the knife from my belt. I do not remember taking it from the pier, and drove it into the deck. The wood split, and seawater sprayed upward, hissing like breath. The tide recoiled, but only for a moment. Then the water surged, dragging me forward. The fisherman's hands closed on my shoulders. The last thing I saw before going under was the horizon, a thin line of pale light, far too distant to reach. The last thing I heard was the tide, whispering through my teeth as the water closed over my head. "We have you now."